jet sliced through the Alaskan night, its silver body a ghostly blur against the vast, frozen wilderness below. Inside, the warm glow of cabin lights illuminated the 10 passengers, all dressed in corporate attire, clutching cocktails and making idle conversation. Ethan Cole sat near the back, his sharp blue eyes scanning the cabin. He had never liked corporate retreats. As a former military survival instructor turned security consultant, he wasn't exactly the type to mingle with executives who thrived on power plays and profit margins. He was only here because of a contract with Arcadia Global, the high-stakes conglomerate funding this luxurious getaway. Across from him, Claire Monroe, Arcadia's chief financial officer, leaned back in her seat, twirling the stem of her wine glass. Smart, ambitious, and too quick with numbers, Claire had built her career out of predicting disasters before they happened. "Excited for the retreat?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. Ethan smirked. "Can't wait." Further up, Marcus Reed, Arcadia's ruthless CEO, laughed too loudly at something his assistant, Elena Vasquez, had whispered. Jackson, the seasoned pilot, was behind the controls, guiding the jet smoothly through the icy sky. Then came the first jolt. Slight tremor. Nothing alarming. The second one was harder. Wine splashed from Claire's glass. Ethan sat up straight. His instincts, honed from years of surviving the worst nature had to offer, went on high alert. Then the cabin lights flickered. Alarms blared. Oxygen masks dropped, swaying eerily as the jet lurched. The aircraft shuddered violently, metal groaning under the sudden loss of control. Luggage tumbled from overhead compartments, scattering across the aisle. A sharp voice crackled through the intercom. "Brace for impact." Screams, then free fall. The jet nosedived, cutting through the abyss of white. Impact, darkness, silence. The first sensation Ethan felt was the biting cold, a merciless and unforgiving force that seeped through his clothes like a malevolent entity, piercing his skin and chilling his bones to the marrow. The cold air stung his lungs like 1,000 needles, making each ragged gasp a painful ordeal, his breath visible in the frigid air. Ethan's exhales danced before him like wispy ghosts, ethereal and otherworldly. As he forced his eyes open, a sharp, throbbing pain radiated from his ribs, making his vision blur like a watercolor painting in the rain. He winced, his mind foggy and disoriented, his thoughts disjointed and fragmented. The world around him was a white blur, an endless expanse of snow that seemed to stretch on forever, a desolate and unforgiving landscape. Ethan's gaze wandered, taking in the devastation around him. The private jet lay in shattered pieces, its sleek silver body torn apart by the brutal impact, like a toy broken by a careless child. The main cabin was cracked open, its once pristine interior now a twisted mess of metal, wires, and shattered glass, like a macabre sculpture created by a mad artist. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, fuel, and something darker, blood, the coppery scent of which seemed to cling to the back of his throat like a bad omen. Ethan's stomach churned as he took in the carnage, his mind struggling to process the sheer scale of the destruction. With a Herculean effort, Ethan forced himself to move, his body protesting every inch of the way. Every muscle screamed in agony as he unbuckled his seatbelt, stumbling to his feet like a newborn giraffe taking its first tentative steps. His boots sank into the deep snow, the cold seeping into his bones like a slow-moving poison. The wind howled through the broken fuselage, its mournful cry echoing through the desolate landscape like the wail of a lost soul. As Ethan turned to survey the wreckage, he spotted Claire Monroe slumped against her seat, her forehead streaked with blood like a crimson badge of honor. She blinked blearily at him, disoriented, her eyes unfocused and glassy. What happened? She rasped, her voice barely audible over the wind, like a whispered secret in a crowded room. The plane went down, Ethan replied, his voice hoarse from the cold, like a rusty gate creaking in the wind. He reached out, gripping her arm to steady her, his hand closing around her wrist like a vice around them. Other survivors stirred, their groans and cries filling the air like a chorus of the damned. Marcus, the billionaire entrepreneur, groaned as he dragged himself from the wreckage, his expensive suit torn and bloodied like a symbol of his shattered pride. Jackson, the pilot, cradled his arm, his face pale with pain, like a ghostly apparition. Ethan counted the survivors, 7 of them still breathing, but others, his stomach clenched as he scanned the wreckage, taking in the bodies slumped in unnatural positions, lifeless and still, like mannequins in a store window. The co-pilot was nowhere to be seen, a fact that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, like a cold wind blowing through a graveyard. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. The cockpit door was open, the co-pilot's seat empty, like a gaping void. Someone had left before the crash, someone who knew it was coming, a fact that seemed to whisper sinister secrets in Ethan's ear like a malevolent spirit. Ethan's mind reeled as he processed the implications, his thoughts racing like a runaway train. Who could have predicted the crash? And why had they left the others to die? The questions swirled in his mind like a maelstrom. But Ethan knew he had to focus on survival, for himself and the others, a fact that seemed to crystallize in his mind, like a beacon of hope in a desolate landscape. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, transforming the wreckage site into a frozen graveyard. The survivors moved with a sense of urgency, scavenging what they could from the scattered debris. They gathered blankets, a flare gun, and the remnants of a half-frozen first aid kit, their movements swift and purposeful as they struggled to stay warm and alive. As night began to fall, they built a fire near the broken fuselage, its weak glow barely piercing the surrounding darkness. The flames danced and flickered, casting eerie shadows on the snow-covered trees. making it seem as though the forest itself was alive and watching them. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke, fuel, and the acrid tang of burned metal, a noxious mixture that hung in the air like a miasma. Jackson, the pilot, rubbed his injured arm, his eyes clouded with concern. "I flew this route 100 times," he muttered, his voice low and troubled, his words laced with a sense of bewilderment. Something wasn't right with the controls. The instruments failed before we even hit turbulence. His words hung in the air, a mixture of confusion and frustration, as though he was struggling to comprehend the incomprehensible. Ethan met Claire's gaze across the fire, their eyes locking in a silent understanding. They both knew that something was off, that the crash was more than just a tragic accident. It was as though they shared a secret, a knowledge that only they understood. Marcus, however, scoffed at the idea, his expression dismissive. "Planes crash," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism, his words a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty that hung in the air. "We need a plan, not paranoia." But Ethan wasn't convinced. A plane didn't just drop out of the sky without a reason. Someone had made it happen, and he was determined to find out who. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, a cold dread that seeped into his bones like a slow-moving poison. It was as though he had stumbled into a nightmare, a world where nothing made sense, and the rules of reality no longer applied. And then, without warning, the scream pierced the night air. It was distant, carried by the wind, but unmistakable. It came from the forest, a primal cry that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. The fire seemed to flicker in response, casting eerie shadows on the trees, as though the very darkness itself was alive and moving. The survivors exchanged nervous glances, their faces illuminated only by the faint glow of the fire. The scream seemed to hang in the air, a haunting echo that refused to fade, a reminder that they were not alone in the wilderness. In that moment, Ethan knew that they were trapped in a desperate struggle for survival, a fight against the unforgiving elements and the unknown dangers that lurked in the shadows. The scream had changed everything, a stark reminder that they were not alone, that something was out there, watching and waiting. Morning arrived in eerie silence, as though the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The survivors emerged from their makeshift shelter, bleary-eyed and stiff from the cold, their bodies aching from the crash, and their minds reeling from the shock. The air was crisp and clean, with a hint of wood smoke and the sweet scent of pine, but it was also heavy with an almost palpable sense of unease. As they stumbled out into the bright morning light, they were met with a sight that made their blood run cold. Elena Vasquez was gone. Her seat was empty, a gaping void that seemed to scream her absence. There were no footprints in the snow, no signs of struggle, no indication of what might have happened to her. Just gone. The silence was oppressive, the stillness unnatural, and the survivors' minds were filled with a sense of dread and foreboding. Panic gripped the survivors like a vice, its icy fingers closing around their hearts and squeezing tight. They exchanged nervous glances, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Jackson swore he heard something moving in the night, a faint rustling in the underbrush that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now loomed large in his mind. He remembered the sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching, the soft hooting of an owl in the distance, and the creaking of trees swaying in the wind. But most of all, he remembered the feeling of being watched, the sensation of unseen eyes upon him. Claire refused to believe it, her eyes flashing with denial, as she insisted that Elena must have simply wandered off in the night. She was convinced that Elena was still out there somewhere, and that they just needed to find her. But Ethan knew better. He knew that something was off, that the silence was oppressive and the stillness was unnatural. He felt it in his bones, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into his very marrow. Marcus insisted they focus on finding shelter instead of playing detective, his voice gruff and practical as he urged them to prioritize their survival. He was a pragmatist, a man who dealt in facts and figures, and he didn't have time for speculation or conjecture. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, that there was more to Elena's disappearance than met the eye. He knew that the wilderness was a cruel and unforgiving place, where the strong survived and the weak perished. But he also knew that they weren't alone out here. Someone or something was out there, watching and waiting. As the survivors began to search for Elena, their footprints trampling the pristine snow, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The forest seemed to be closing in around them, the trees looming like sentinels, and the wind whispering secrets in their ears. He knew that they had to find Elena, had to uncover the truth behind her disappearance. But he also knew that they were running out of time, that the clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and Ethan knew that they had to move fast if they were going to survive. Snowflakes swirled in the air, dancing around Ethan like a mesmerizing waltz of white as he examined the spot where Elena had last been seen. The area was pristine, untouched, and eerily silent, as though the very forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The snow-covered trees stood like sentinels, their branches etched against the gray sky like a delicate pen and ink drawing. The air was crisp and clean, with a hint of wood smoke and the sweet scent of pine, but it was also heavy with an almost palpable sense of unease. There were no footprints, no signs of disturbance, no indication of what might have happened to Elena. Just empty space where a person should have been, a void that seemed to scream her absence. The silence was oppressive, the stillness unnatural, and Ethan's mind was racing with possibilities. Had she been taken? Had she wandered off, or was something more sinister at play? Claire stood beside him, hugging her arms against the cold, her eyes scanning the surrounding area with a growing sense of unease. Her breath misted in the air, a faint cloud of vapor that seemed to cling to her like a damp shroud. "This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she feared being overheard by some unseen presence. She wouldn't just leave. Her words hung in the air, a mixture of confusion and concern, as though she was struggling to comprehend the incomprehensible. Marcus, however, was less concerned, his expression a mask of indifference. "If she ran, that's on her," he said, his voice dripping with a callous disregard, as though Elena's disappearance was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His eyes seemed to gleam with a cold, calculating light, as though he was weighing the pros and cons of their situation. But Jackson was quick to snap back, his voice rising in anger. "Ran where?" he demanded, his eyes flashing with frustration. "We're in the middle of nowhere." The wind howled through the wreckage, sending a chill through Ethan's bones, as though the very forest itself was warning them of the dangers that lurked within. Ethan's mind was racing, his thoughts consumed by the mystery of Elena's disappearance. Someone or something had taken her, and if they didn't figure out what was happening, they'd be next. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, a cold dread that seeped into his bones, like a slow-moving poison. He felt a creeping sense of paranoia, as though they were being watched by unseen eyes. He knew that they had to find Elena, had to uncover the truth behind her disappearance, but he also knew that they were running out of time, that the clock was ticking and the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. The forest seemed to be closing in around them, the trees looming like sentinels, and the wind whispering secrets in their ears. Ethan knew that they had to act fast, or risk being consumed by the very wilderness that surrounded them. The survivors split into two groups, their decision born of necessity and desperation, as though they were grasping at straws in a desperate bid to survive. Ethan, Claire, and Jackson would venture into the unknown, braving the treacherous terrain and the unforgiving elements in search of Elena, their hearts heavy with a sense of foreboding. Marcus and the others would stay behind, tasked with the crucial job of fortifying the wreckage, their makeshift shelter a fragile bulwark against the fury of the wilderness, a tiny oasis of safety in a sea of uncertainty. As Ethan, Claire, and Jackson set out, the snow seemed to swallow them whole, its deep drifts slowing their progress to a crawl, as though the very earth itself was conspiring against them. The wilderness stretched endlessly around them, a vast and silent expanse of white that seemed to mock their tiny, insignificant forms, a reminder of their own mortality and the fragility of human life. The only sound was the wind, its mournful sighs and whispers weaving a haunting melody that seemed to echo through their very souls, a chilling reminder of the desolation and isolation that surrounded them. But then, like a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape, Ethan spotted something, a torn scrap of fabric half buried in the snow. its faded color a stark contrast to the pristine white that surrounded it, a jarring reminder of the violence and brutality that had been visited upon Elena. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he realized what it was. A piece of Elena's coat, ripped and torn as though it had been pulled from her body with brutal force. A chilling testament to the ferocity of the attack. Next to the fabric, leading away into the trees, were faint, uneven footprints, a trail of subtle signs and clues that seemed to whisper secrets to Ethan's trained eyes. They were light, as though someone had tried to brush them away. But Ethan's experienced gaze picked up on the faint impressions, the slight disturbances in the snow that told a story of violence and coercion. His mind racing, he turned to Claire and Jackson, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he feared being overheard by some unseen presence. "Someone dragged her," he murmured, the words feeling like a stone settling in his gut, a cold, hard truth that seemed to seep into his very bones. The realization was a crushing blow, a devastating truth that seemed to shatter their last vestiges of hope. Elena hadn't walked away, hadn't simply wandered off into the wilderness. She had been taken, pulled from the wreckage with a force that had left behind only the faintest of signs, a chilling reminder of the sinister forces that lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike. The thought sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into his very soul, a growing realization that they were dealing with something truly evil, something that had deliberately taken Elena and left behind only the faintest of clues. The footprints led to a rocky outcrop where the snow thinned and shadows stretched long, like skeletal fingers reaching out to snuff out the last vestiges of light. The air was heavy with an eerie silence, as though the very forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The trees seemed to loom over them, their branches creaking ominously in the wind, like the rusty hinges of a crypt door. Then, a sound, a whisper of movement, a ragged breath. The noise was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into his very bones. His heart racing, he raised his makeshift torch, the flickering fire casting eerie shadows on the surrounding rocks. The flame danced and spat, casting a warm golden light on the dark, unforgiving stone. And then, as the light faltered and recovered, Ethan saw it. A narrow cave entrance, a dark and foreboding maw that seemed to yawn open like the mouth of some ancient, slumbering beast. The entrance was a void, a black hole that seemed to suck the light out of the air, leaving only an oppressive sense of darkness and foreboding. Inside, something moved. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to echo through the cave, a soft, whispery noise that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Cautiously, he stepped forward, his pulse pounding in his temples like a drum. Claire and Jackson flanked him, their faces set and determined, their eyes fixed on the dark, mysterious entrance. The air inside the cave was stale and musty, heavy with the scent of damp earth and mold. It was a smell that seemed to cling to their skin, a noxious miasma that seemed to seep into their very pores. And then, in the dim, flickering firelight, they saw her, Elena. She sat hunched against the cave wall, her eyes wide and unseeing, her face pale and drawn. Her breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling with a slow, labored rhythm. She seemed to be in a trance, her eyes fixed on some point beyond their comprehension, her face a mask of terror and fear. But it was her voice that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. When she finally spoke, her words were low and husky, her tone flat and emotionless. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their own ragged breathing. The words seemed to hang in the air, a cold, hard truth that seemed to seep into their very souls. "They're coming." The phrase echoed through Ethan's mind, a haunting refrain that seemed to whisper secrets in his ear. Who was coming? And what did they want? The questions swirled through his mind, a maddening vortex of fear and uncertainty. As they stood there, frozen in terror, the darkness seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening and twisting into grotesque, menacing forms. The air seemed to thicken, becoming heavy with an almost palpable sense of malevolence. And then, in the distance, they heard it, a low, ominous rumble like thunder on a summer day. But it wasn't thunder. It was something far more sinister, something that was coming for them. Ethan knelt beside Elena, his eyes locked on hers as he tried to comprehend the terror that seemed to emanate from her very pores. The air around them was heavy with an almost palpable sense of dread, as though the very forest itself was watching them, waiting for them to make their next move. "Who's coming?" Ethan asked, his voice low and urgent, as though he feared that the very act of speaking might summon some unseen horror from the depths of the forest. Elena didn't answer at first, her hands trembling violently, as though she was struggling to contain some inner turmoil. Her lips were turning blue from the cold, her skin pale and clammy to the touch. She seemed to be in shock, her eyes wide and unseeing as though she was staring into some abyss of terror that threatened to consume her whole. The silence between them was oppressive, a heavy blanket of fear that seemed to suffocate them all. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Elena whispered her response. "They took me," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of their own ragged breathing. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down to the unknown forces that seemed to be gathering around them. "I don't know how long I was gone," she added, her voice cracking with emotion. Claire pressed her for more information, her voice gentle but insistent. "You were taken?" she asked, her eyes locked on Elena's, as though she was trying to will her into revealing some hidden truth. Elena nodded weakly, her eyes dropping to the ground, as though she was ashamed of what had happened to her. "They watch," she whispered. "They wait." The words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into his very bones. Jackson looked uneasy, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing as though he feared that they were being watched even now. The trees seemed to loom over them, their branches creaking ominously in the wind, like the rusty hinges of a crypt door. "Who's they?" Jackson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena's hollow gaze met his, her eyes empty and unseeing as though she was staring into some void of terror that threatened to consume them all. "The ones who made the plane crash," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their own ragged breathing. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down to the unknown forces that seemed to be gathering around them. Ethan felt a cold dread creeping up his spine, a sense of foreboding that seemed to seep into his very bones. They were not alone in the forest. They were being watched, and they were being waited for. And Elena's words seemed to suggest that their plane crash had not been an accident, but a deliberate act of sabotage. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into his very soul. They were in grave danger, and they didn't even know who or what they were up against. As they carried Elena back to the wreckage, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She was quiet, almost catatonic, as though she had retreated into some inner world of her own. Her eyes seemed to hold 1,000-yard stare, a vacant expression that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. She barely spoke, her responses monosyllabic and lacking in emotion, as though she was struggling to find the words to express the horrors she had witnessed. Her refusal to eat was equally alarming, her eyes sunken and her skin pale, as though she was slowly starving from the inside out. And at night, Ethan caught her staring at them while they slept, her eyes gleaming with a strange, almost feral light, as though she was watching them with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. It was as though she had been changed by her experience, as though something had been awakened within her that could not be contained. Ethan felt a growing sense of unease, a creeping dread that seemed to seep into his very bones. What had happened to Elena during her time away from the group? And what was happening to her now? Was she still one of them? Or had she been transformed into something else entirely? The questions swirled through his mind, a maddening vortex of fear and uncertainty. As he searched the wreckage for more supplies, Ethan stumbled upon a discovery that would change everything. Underneath the cockpit, buried in the snow, was a hidden compartment. It was cleverly concealed, almost invisible to the naked eye, as though it had been designed to remain hidden forever. But Ethan's trained gaze picked up on the subtle signs of disturbance, the faint outlines of a door that blended seamlessly into the surrounding wreckage. He pushed the door open, his heart racing with anticipation. Inside, he found a briefcase marked with the Arcadia Global logo. The logo seemed to leap out at him, a symbol of power and corruption that seemed to mock him with its very presence. Ethan's mind was racing, his thoughts consumed by the implications of what he had found. What was Arcadia Global's involvement in the plane crash? And what secrets lay hidden in the briefcase? He opened the briefcase, his hands trembling with anticipation. Inside, he found classified documents detailing an off-the-books experiment. The documents were cryptic, but they seemed to suggest that the experiment involved human subjects. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized the implications of what he had found. They were not just survivors of a plane crash. They were test subjects, and the experiment was far from over. A chill ran down Ethan's spine as he realized the true horror of their situation. They were trapped in a living nightmare, a twisted game of survival where the rules were constantly changing. And the players, they were just pawns, disposable test subjects in a sinister experiment that seemed to have no end. Ethan confronted Marcus, slamming the documents onto the frozen ground with a force that sent shock waves through the air. The papers fluttered open, revealing the incriminating evidence that seemed to seal Marcus's fate. The words danced across the page, a damning indictment of Marcus's treachery that seemed to leap off the page and slap Ethan in the face. "Explain this," Ethan growled, his voice low and menacing, as though he was barely containing rage that threatened to consume him whole. His eyes blazed with a fierce intensity, as though he was daring Marcus to reveal the truth, no matter how ugly or sinister it might be. Marcus didn't even flinch, his expression impassive, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. His eyes seemed to bore into Ethan's soul, a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to strip away all pretenses and reveal the true depths of his depravity. "The plane wasn't an accident," Marcus said, his voice dripping with malice, as though he was savoring the chaos and destruction he had unleashed. His words seemed to hang in the air, a cold, hard truth that seemed to seep into their very souls like a chill wind. Claire's eyes widened, her face pale with shock, as though she had been punched in the gut. "You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Her eyes seemed to fill with tears, a deep, welling sorrow that seemed to threaten to consume her whole. Marcus shrugged, his shoulders rising and falling with a casual indifference, as though he was discussing the weather rather than a catastrophic event that had almost claimed their lives. His expression was impassive, a cold, calculating mask that seemed to strip away all pretenses and reveal the true depths of his depravity. "It was necessary," Marcus said, his voice devoid of emotion, as though he was discussing a mere abstraction rather than a brutal act of sabotage. His words seemed to hang in the air, a cold, hard truth that seemed to seep into their very souls like a chill wind. Rage boiled inside Ethan, a cauldron of fury that seemed to seethe and bubble with an intensity that threatened to consume him whole. His mind was racing, a jumble of emotions and thoughts that seemed to collide and swirl in a maddening vortex of confusion and rage. "You set us up," Ethan growled, his voice low and menacing, as though he was accusing Marcus of a crime that was almost too heinous to comprehend. His eyes seemed to bore into Marcus's soul, a fierce, unyielding gaze that seemed to demand the truth, no matter what the cost. Marcus smirked, his lips curling up with a sly, self-satisfied smile, as though he was enjoying some private joke that was beyond their comprehension. His eyes seemed to glint with a malevolent light, a cold, calculating intelligence that seemed to strip away all pretenses and reveal the true depths of his depravity. "Not all of us," Marcus said, his eyes glinting with a sinister light, as though he was hinting at some deeper conspiracy that went far beyond their little group. His words seemed to hang in the air, a cold, hard truth that seemed to seep into their very souls like a chill wind. And then he glanced at Elena, his eyes locking onto hers with a strange, almost conspiratorial intensity, as though they shared some secret that was beyond the rest of them. Elena smiled back. The truth slammed into Ethan with the force of a freight train, a crushing blow that left him reeling. It had been a trap from the start. Arcadia Global had orchestrated the crash, using the passengers as test subjects for some twisted experiment. The thought sent a chill down his spine, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into his very bones like a cold, dark fog. Elena's transformation was the final nail in the coffin, a shocking revelation that left Ethan's mind reeling. Her head tilted unnaturally, her pupils dilated, as though she was no longer in control of her own body. Her eyes seemed to bore into Ethan's soul, a cold, calculating gaze that sent shivers down his spine, like a rusty gate scraping against concrete. The air seemed to vibrate with tension, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to suffocate them all. "You should have left me in the cave," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees like a mournful sigh. The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine, a sense of foreboding that seemed to seep into his very bones, like a slow-moving poison. And then she lunged, her body moving with a jerky, unnatural motion, as though she was a puppet on a string, manipulated by some unseen force. Chaos erupted, the group scattering in all directions as they tried to escape Elena's deadly grasp. The wilderness, once their only enemy, had just become the least of their worries. They were trapped, caught in a desperate game of survival, where the rules were constantly changing like a living, breathing entity. The group's chances of survival seemed to dwindle with every passing moment, as though they were trapped in a desperate game of cat and mouse. The stakes were higher than ever, with their very lives hanging in the balance like a delicate, sparkling thread. Ethan's mind was racing, his thoughts consumed by the implications of what they had discovered. They were test subjects, pawns in a twisted game of survival. And Elena, once one of their own, had become a deadly enemy, a monster created by the very experiment they were trying to escape. The forest seemed to close in around them, a suffocating, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to squeeze the air from their lungs. They were trapped, caught in a living nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. The trees loomed above them, their branches creaking ominously in the wind like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch them from the jaws of freedom. Elena's body seemed to contort and twist in ways that defied human anatomy, her limbs elongating and contracting like a puppet on a string. Her fingers clawed at Ethan's throat with an unnatural speed and agility, her nails raking across his skin like razor-sharp talons. The sound of her attack was like a rusty gate scraping against concrete, a harsh, jarring noise that seemed to shatter the very air around them. Ethan barely managed to shove her off, sending her staggering backward into the wreckage with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the forest. The impact was like a thunderclap, a deafening crash that seemed to reverberate through every cell in their bodies. The sound of Jackson's voice was like a distant echo, a faint cry of horror that seemed to come from 1,000 miles away. "What the hell?" he shouted, stumbling backward as though he was trying to escape the sheer terror that seemed to emanate from Elena's twisted form. His eyes were wide with fear, his face pale and sweaty, as though he had just witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elena's breathing was shallow and erratic, her chest heaving with a rapid, unnatural rhythm that seemed to be driven by some malignant force that had taken up residence within her. Her body seemed to be undergoing some kind of grotesque transformation, as though she was being rewritten from the inside out. And then she laughed. But it wasn't her voice. It was something else. A low, menacing chuckle that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. The sound was like a cold wind blowing through a graveyard. A mournful, haunting noise that seemed to freeze their very blood. Her lips curled into a twisted grin, her eyes locking onto Ethan with a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to bore into his very soul. "It's inside me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "And now, it's inside you too." The words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, a cold, hard truth that seemed to seep into Ethan's very bones, like a slow-moving poison. His blood turned to ice, his mind reeling with the implications of what Elena had just revealed. The experiment wasn't just about survival, it was about control. Ethan's thoughts were consumed by the horror of it all, the sheer scale of the conspiracy that seemed to have ensnared them all. They were test subjects, pawns in a twisted game of survival, where the rules were constantly changing. And Elena, once one of their own, had become a deadly enemy, a monster created by the very experiment they were trying to escape. The forest seemed to close in around them, a suffocating, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to squeeze the air from their lungs. They were trapped, caught in a desperate game of cat and mouse, where the stakes were higher than ever. And Ethan knew that they had to escape, no matter what the cost. They restrained Elena, tying her hands with a torn seatbelt, her wrists bound tightly as though they were trying to contain a wild animal that had been unleashed from the depths of hell. Her eyes were glazed over with an unnatural calm, a creepy serenity that seemed to mask the malevolent force that had taken up residence within her. She whispered to herself in a low, raspy voice that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. The words, indistinguishable, but the tone unmistakable. A cold, calculating menace that seemed to seep into their very bones. Like a slow-moving poison, Ethan dug into the wreckage, his hands scrabbling through the twisted metal and debris, searching for anything useful that might aid in their survival. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and fuel, the acrid smell burning his lungs as he rummaged through the wreckage. That's when he found the emergency radio, its plastic casing cracked and broken, wires frayed and exposed, battery nearly dead, but it was transmitting a faint, repeating signal that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as though it was beckoning them deeper into the heart of the conspiracy. A distorted voice crackled through the speakers, the words barely intelligible, but the tone unmistakable, cold, calculating, and menacing. Control. Confirmed. Phase 2. Initiated. The words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. A cold, hard truth that seemed to seep into Ethan's very bones like a slow-moving poison. The voice was like a rusty gate scraping against the concrete, a harsh, jarring noise that seemed to shatter the very air around them. Ethan's stomach twisted, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had just heard. Someone was still watching them, monitoring their every move, controlling the experiment from behind the scenes. The thought sent a chill down his spine, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into his very bones. And the experiment wasn't over. Phase 2 had been initiated, a new level of terror and survival that seemed to stretch out before them like an endless, desolate landscape. The forest seemed to close in and around them, the trees looming above like sentinels, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. The sound was like 1,000 skeletal fingers scratching against the bark, a haunting, mournful noise that seemed to echo through the very depths of their souls. Ethan felt a creeping sense of dread, a feeling that they were trapped in a desperate game of survival, with no escape from the clutches of their sinister controllers. The radio's transmission seemed to mock them, a cold, calculating reminder that they were nothing more than pawns in a twisted game of survival. The voice seemed to laugh at them, a cold, mirthless sound that seemed to echo through the very depths of their souls. They were trapped, caught in a desperate game of cat and mouse, with no escape from the clutches of their sinister controllers. Claire confronted Marcus, her voice shaking with fury, her eyes blazing with a fierce intensity that seemed to pierce through the very soul of the traitor. "You knew about this," she spat, her words dripping with venom. "You knew what they were doing here." The air seemed to vibrate with tension, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to suffocate them all. Marcus didn't deny it. Instead, he seemed to shrink into himself, his eyes darting nervously around the group as though he was searching for an escape route. "I wasn't supposed to crash with you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was meant to observe." The words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, a cold, hard truth that seemed to seep into their very bones like a slow-moving poison. Jackson cursed, his voice low and menacing, as though he was barely containing a fury that threatened to erupt at any moment. "You son of a," he snarled, his eyes blazing with a fierce intensity that seemed to pierce through the very soul of the traitor. Marcus held up his hands, a placating gesture that seemed to only enrage Jackson further. "But I wasn't the only one sent here," he said, his voice laced with a sinister tone that seemed to send shivers down Ethan's spine. Ethan stiffened, his mind reeling with the implications of what Marcus had just revealed. Marcus wasn't working alone. There were others hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees looming above like sentinels, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. The sound was like 1,000 skeletal fingers scratching against the bark, a haunting, mournful noise that seemed to echo through the very depths of their souls. Ethan felt a creeping sense of dread, a feeling that they were trapped in a desperate game of survival, with no escape from the clutches of their sinister controllers. Marcus's words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, a cold, hard truth that seemed to seep into their very bones. Like a slow-moving poison, they were pawns in a twisted game of survival, with no control over their own destiny. And Marcus, the traitor, was just at the tip of the iceberg. A blizzard of unholy fury rolled in, its icy grip crushing everything in its path, like a malevolent entity determined to snuff out their lives. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that swallowed the wreckage whole, burying it beneath a thick layer of white that seemed to stretch on forever. The group was trapped, imprisoned in a frozen world from which there was no escape, forced to endure the wrath of the storm until it finally subsided. The group huddled together, their faces pale and frightened, as they watched the storm rage on with a mesmerizing horror. They couldn't leave, couldn't run. They were at the mercy of the blizzard, forced to endure its fury until it finally burned itself out. But the storm was only half the problem. Whatever was inside, Elena was spreading, its influence seeping into the very fabric of their reality, like a slow-moving poison. Ethan checked his hands, his arms, searching for any sign of the infection, any indication that he had been compromised. He examined his skin, his eyes scanning every inch for any sign of abnormality, his heart racing with a growing sense of dread. But he didn't find anything. No marks, no discoloration, no signs of infection. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. The thought sent a chill down his spine, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into his very bones, like a cold, dark fog. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside him, watching and waiting, its presence hidden just beneath the surface, like a coiled snake waiting to strike. The others seemed to sense it too, their eyes darting nervously towards Elena, who sat quietly, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance. Her expression was serene, almost peaceful, but Ethan knew better. He knew that whatever was inside her was just waiting for its chance to strike, to spread its influence and claim them all. The storm raged on outside, its fury unabated. But Ethan knew that the real danger lay within, whatever was inside. Elena was a ticking time bomb, waiting to unleash its full fury upon them, and Ethan had no idea how to stop it. The thought sent a wave of panic crashing through his mind, a desperate sense of urgency that seemed to drive him to the very edge of sanity. As the storm raged on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Whatever was inside, Elena was growing stronger by the minute, its influence spreading like a cancer through their little group, and Ethan knew that if they didn't find a way to stop it, they would all be consumed, trapped in a living nightmare from which there was no escape. The first one to die was Jackson. They woke to find his body outside the wreckage, half buried in snow, his throat slit with a precision that seemed almost surgical. The wound was a deep, ragged gash, as though Jackson's throat had been torn open by some unseen force, leaving behind a trail of blood that seemed to stain the snow like a gruesome signature. But there were no footprints leading to the body, no sign of a struggle. It was as if Jackson had walked out there on his own, surrendering himself to the darkness that lurked beyond the wreckage like a malevolent entity waiting to claim its next victim. Ethan's mind reeled with the implications of what he was seeing. He felt a creeping sense of dread, a growing realization that they were trapped in a desperate game of survival, where the rules were constantly changing and the stakes were higher than ever. The thought sent a chill down his spine, a cold, dark fear that seemed to seep into his very bones, like a slow-moving poison. He checked their supplies, his eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of what had happened to Jackson. That's when he noticed that the flare gun was missing. So was Marcus. The realization hit Ethan like a sledgehammer, a crushing blow that left him reeling. Marcus was gone, vanished into the night without a trace, leaving behind only the faintest hint of his presence, and the flare gun was with him, a deadly tool that could be used to hunt them down and kill them like animals in a twisted game of survival. Ethan felt a wave of panic wash over him, a desperate sense of urgency that seemed to drive him to the very edge of sanity. He knew that they had to get out of there, to escape the wreckage and the darkness that lurked beyond. But where could they go? The storm was still raging outside, a blizzard of snow and ice that seemed to stretch on forever, a vast and endless expanse of white that seemed to swallow everything in its path. And Marcus was out there, armed with the flare gun and a deadly determination to hunt them down. Ethan could feel his eyes upon them, a cold and calculating gaze that seemed to bore into their very souls. He knew that they had to move, to keep running and fighting if they wanted to survive. But the question was, where could they go? And how could they escape the clutches of the sinister forces that seemed to be driving them towards a desperate and deadly confrontation? Marcus had vanished into the storm, leaving behind a trail of footprints that seemed to lead to nowhere. Ethan and Claire followed his tracks, their hearts pounding in their chests as they struggled to keep up with the fleeing figure. The howling wind and near-zero visibility made every step a perilous journey into the unknown, the cold stabbing into their bones like 1,000 knives. As they trudged through the deepening snow, Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon for any sign of Marcus, his mind racing with the implications of what they had discovered. The storm seemed to be closing in around them, the snow falling in thick, heavy flakes that obscured everything beyond a few feet. Ethan stumbled forward, his feet sinking into the snow, his breath visible in the chill air as he struggled to keep up with Claire. And then, suddenly, he saw him. Marcus was kneeling in the snow, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and terror, his mouth moving soundlessly as though he was trying to scream, but couldn't. Ethan's first thought was that Marcus had succumbed to the extreme cold, his skin turning black from frostbite, but as he looked closer, he realized that something was horribly wrong. Marcus's skin was not just blackened, it was twisted and distorted, as though some unseen force was warping his very flesh. The skin seemed to be stretching, pulling away from the bone, revealing glimpses of raw red tissue beneath. Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him, his stomach churning with a growing sense of horror. And then Marcus turned his head, his eyes locking onto Ethan's with a gaze that was both desperate and malevolent. Ethan felt a jolt of fear run through him, his heart racing with a growing sense of dread. He realized with a dawning sense of horror that Marcus was still alive, despite the twisted, blackened flesh, despite the eyes that seemed to hold a madness within them. Marcus was still breathing, still thinking, still plotting. The implications were too terrible to contemplate. Whatever had happened to Marcus, whatever had driven him to flee into the storm, had not killed him. Instead, it had transformed him, twisted him into something that was no longer human. Ethan felt a creeping sense of dread, a growing realization that they were facing something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. As Ethan stood frozen in terror, Marcus began to rise to his feet, his eyes fixed on Ethan with an unspeakable hunger. Ethan knew that they had to get out of there, to escape the clutches of the monstrous creature that Marcus had become. But as he turned to run, he realized that Claire was nowhere to be found. She had vanished into the storm, leaving Ethan alone to face the horror that was Marcus. Marcus's lips moved, but the voice that emerged was not his own. It was a low, raspy whisper that seemed to carry on the wind, a voice that sent shivers down Ethan's spine like a cold, dead finger tracing the vertebrae of his backbone. The sound was like nothing Ethan had ever heard before, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, a voice that seemed to seep into his very bones like a slow-moving poison. "It's awake now," Marcus whispered, his eyes glinting with a malevolent light that seemed to burn with an otherworldly intensity. "And it knows you." The words seemed to hang in the air, a cold and menacing promise that seemed to seep into Ethan's very bones, like a chill wind blowing through his soul. Ethan's grip on Claire's arm tightened, his fingers digging deep into her flesh as he pulled her close. He could feel her heart racing, her pulse pounding in time with his own, as they both realized the true horror of their situation. "We're leaving," he whispered urgently, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger, his mind racing with the implications of what Marcus had just said. But Marcus didn't follow. He just smiled. A cold and calculating smile that seemed to reveal the true horror that lurked beneath his twisted flesh. It was a smile that seemed to say, "You'll never escape." A smile that seemed to promise a fate worse than death itself. And then, in an instant, Marcus was gone. The wind seemed to swallow him whole, his body dissolving into the storm like a ghostly apparition. Ethan felt a jolt of fear run through him, his heart racing with a growing sense of dread. They were alone now, abandoned to the mercy of the storm and the monstrous forces that lurked within. As they stumbled through the snow, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unblinking eyes were trained on them from the darkness. The wind seemed to carry a voice, a low and menacing whisper that seemed to echo through the storm. "It knows you," the voice seemed to say, the words repeating over and over in Ethan's mind like a deadly mantra. Ethan's skin crawled, his senses on high alert as he scanned the horizon for any sign of danger. He knew that they had to keep moving, to find shelter from the storm and the monstrous forces that lurked within. But as he looked at Claire, he saw the fear in her eyes, the terror that seemed to grip her very soul, and he knew that they might not make it out alive. Ethan and Claire stumbled back to the wreckage, their bodies battered and bruised from the relentless storm that seemed to have no end. The wind howled around them, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But as they approached the twisted metal, Ethan's heart sank. Elena was gone. Her body was nowhere to be found, vanished into the storm like a ghostly apparition that had never existed. The radio crackled again, the sound like a spark of electricity that seemed to ignite the air around them. This time, the voice was clearer, more distinct. "You've been chosen," it said, the words dripping with a sinister intent that seemed to seep into Ethan's very bones. "Return to the coordinates. Await extraction." The voice was like a cold, calculated whisper in Ethan's ear, a reminder that they were trapped in a desperate game of survival, with no escape from the sinister forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. Ethan's pulse hammered in his chest, his heart racing with a growing sense of dread that seemed to suffocate him. The crash wasn't an accident. They weren't meant to survive. They were meant to change. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer, a crushing blow that seemed to shatter his very understanding of the world. The voice on the radio seemed to be echoing in his mind, the words repeating over and over, like a deadly mantra that seemed to hypnotize him into a state of frozen terror. "You've been chosen." Chosen for what? Chosen by whom? The questions swirled in his mind like a maelstrom, a vortex of fear and uncertainty that seemed to pull him under. Ethan's eyes locked onto Claire's, and he saw the same fear reflected back at him. They were pawns in a twisted game, a game of survival that seemed to have no rules and no escape. The storm raged on outside, a reminder of the forces that were arrayed against them, forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. As they stood there, frozen in terror, the radio crackled again. "Return to the coordinates," the voice repeated. "Await extraction." The words seemed to hang in the air, a cold and menacing promise that seemed to seep into their very souls. Ethan knew that they had to make a choice. They could return to the coordinates and await extraction, or they could try to escape, to flee into the storm and hope to survive. But either way, Ethan knew that they were trapped in a desperate game of survival, with no escape from the sinister forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. Claire's grip on Ethan's arm was like a vice, her fingers digging deep into his flesh as she pulled him close. Her eyes were wide with fear. Her pupils dilated as she scanned the horizon, as though searching for an escape route from the living nightmare that had become their reality. "We have to get out of here," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Ethan nodded, his mind racing with the implications of their situation. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no sign of rescue in sight, and they weren't alone. The thought sent a chill down Ethan's spine, a cold and creeping fear that seemed to seep into his very bones. He knew that they had to get out of there, to escape the clutches of the sinister forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. "We need to find higher ground," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. "Somewhere to signal for help." He scanned the horizon, his eyes searching for any sign of a landmark or a vantage point. But the storm seemed to stretch on forever, a vast and endless expanse of white that seemed to swallow everything in its path. But there was a problem. They weren't alone. Figures moved in the storm, their shapes indistinct and menacing. Ethan's heart sank as he realized that they were being watched, that unblinking eyes were trained on them from the darkness. And not all of them were human. The thought sent a jolt of fear through him, a cold and calculating fear that seemed to seep into his very soul. Ethan knew that they had to make a choice. They could try to escape, to flee into the storm and hope to survive. Or they could wait for rescue and hope that it came before it was too late. But either way, Ethan knew that they were running out of time. The storm was getting worse, the wind howling with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, and the figures in the storm were getting closer, their shapes becoming more distinct with every passing moment. As Ethan looked at Claire, he saw the fear reflected back at him, a fear that seemed to grip her very soul. They were trapped in a desperate game of survival, with no escape from the monstrous forces that seemed to be arrayed against them. And as they stood there, frozen in terror, Ethan knew that they had to act fast. They had to escape or die trying. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The final stand came at dawn, the sky a deep, foreboding gray that seemed to press down on them like a physical force, suffocating them with its crushing weight. Ethan and Claire reached the ridge, overlooking the frozen wasteland. their feet heavy with the weight of their own mortality, as though the very earth itself was trying to hold them back. The wreckage smoldered behind them, consumed by fire that seemed to rage with a malevolent fury, as though it was determined to destroy every last remnant of their former lives, leaving them with nothing but the bleak, unforgiving landscape that stretched out before them. As they stood there, frozen in terror, the things that had once been their colleagues emerged from the storm, their twisted, nightmarish forms silhouetted against the gray sky like specters from a living hell. They moved with a stiff, jerky gait, their eyes black as coal, their skin gray and decaying, as though they had been resurrected from the dead, reanimated by some dark and malevolent force that seemed to drive them forward with an unnatural hunger. Lena stood at the front, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes fixed on Ethan and Claire with a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to bore into their very souls. "You belong here now," she said, her voice low and menacing, a voice that seemed to come from beyond the grave, echoing through the desolate landscape like a death knell. Ethan gritted his teeth, his heart pounding in his chest like a jackhammer, as though it was trying to break free from the prison of his rib cage. He knew that they couldn't go back, not now, not ever. They had to keep moving forward, no matter what horrors lay ahead, no matter what terrors awaited them in the darkness. "No," Ethan said, his voice firm, resolute, a defiant cry in the face of the monstrous forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. He raised the flare gun, his hand shaking with fear, but his determination unwavering, a beacon of hope in the darkness that seemed to close in around them like a suffocating shroud. He knew that this was their only chance, their last stand against the sinister forces that seemed to be closing in around them like a trap. And then he fired. The flare shot out of the gun, a blazing ball of fire that seemed to illuminate the dark, foreboding landscape like a miniature sun, casting long, ominous shadows across the snow. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to escape, to flee from the clutches of the monstrous forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. But as the flare soared through the air, Ethan knew that it was more than just a desperate attempt to escape. It was a declaration of war, a defiant stand against the monstrous forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate, a refusal to surrender to the darkness that seemed to close in around them like a suffocating shroud. The flare gun's blast ignited a dry tree branch, unleashing a maelstrom of flames that spread rapidly through the frozen landscape like a living, breathing entity. The fire crackled and spat, casting flickering shadows across the snow as it devoured everything in its path. The flames danced with a malevolent fury, as though they were driven by a sinister intent to consume everything in their path. Smoke thickened the air, a choking, acrid fog that seemed to cling to their skin like a damp, cold shroud, suffocating them with its crushing weight. And for a moment, the figures in the storm hesitated, their twisted, nightmarish forms silhouetted against the flames like specters from a living hell. The fire seemed to have momentarily stunned them, frozen them in place like statues. But it was only a momentary reprieve. Then, movement. The figures began to stir, their stiff, jerky gait giving way to a slow, deliberate pace as they closed in on Ethan and Claire. Elena didn't flinch, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she watched the flames dance across the snow. Her pupils were blown wide, her eyes black as coal, and her skin gray and decaying. She seemed to be waiting for something to happen, waiting for Ethan and Claire to make their move. "You think fire will stop it?" she whispered, her voice low and menacing, a voice that seemed to come from beyond the grave. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a cold, calculating taunt that seemed to dare Ethan and Claire to try and escape. But Ethan didn't respond. He didn't have time. He grabbed Claire's hand and ran, the flames roaring behind them like a living, breathing entity. The heat was intense, the flames licking at their heels like a hungry predator. Behind them, the storm screamed, the wind howling with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The things followed, their twisted, nightmarish forms, emerging from the smoke like specters from a living hell. Ethan and Claire ran, their feet pounding against the snow as they desperately sought to escape the clutches of the monstrous forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. But as they ran, Ethan knew that they couldn't outrun the storm forever. Eventually, they would have to face whatever horrors lay ahead and fight for their very survival. The thought sent a chill down his spine, a cold and creeping fear that seemed to seep into his very bones. They were running out of time, and they knew it. The ice cracked and groaned under their feet as they ran, the frozen lake stretching out before them like an endless expanse of white, seemingly infinite and unforgiving. The sound of their pursuers echoed across the ice, their footsteps pounding out a relentless rhythm that seemed to grow louder with every passing moment. Ethan could feel the fear rising up inside him, a cold and creeping dread that seemed to seep into his very bones. He knew that they couldn't outrun the monstrous forces that were driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. Not forever. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though willing herself to escape the clutches of the sinister forces that seemed to be closing in around them. But then, in an instant, she slipped, her feet flying out from under her as she landed hard on the ice. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he turned to grab her arm, yanking her away from a dark fracture in the ice that seemed to yawn open like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. And then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time itself, the lake split open, the ice shattering like glass as something rose from beneath. Ethan's heart stopped as he stared into the abyss, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was seeing. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. It was a thing, a monstrous, eldritch horror that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. its twisted, nightmarish form writhing and twisting like a living shadow. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind dying as though it itself was afraid to breathe in the presence of this monstrous entity. Ethan felt his grip on Claire's arm tighten, his fingers digging deep into her flesh as though trying to anchor himself to reality. But it was too late. The thing was rising, its twisted form emerging from the depths of the lake like a specter from a living hell. And Ethan knew that they were doomed. They were trapped in a desperate game of survival, with no escape from the monstrous forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. The thing was closing in, its twisted form looming over them like a specter of death. And Ethan knew that they had to act fast, or risk being consumed by the very horror that they were trying to escape. But as he looked into Claire's eyes, he saw the fear reflected back at him, a fear that seemed to grip her very soul. They were running out of time, and they knew it. A figure emerged from the water, its presence seeming to fill the air with an unspeakable horror that was palpable, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into Ethan's very bones. The figure's form was twisted and distorted, as though it had been born from the very depths of the lake itself, forged from the darkest, most primal fears of the human psyche. It had no face, no eyes, yet Ethan felt its gaze upon him, a cold and calculating scrutiny that seemed to pierce his very soul, laying bare his deepest fears and anxieties. Claire screamed, her voice echoing across the ice like a cry of despair, as though she too felt the weight of the figure's gaze upon her. The sound was like a knife to Ethan's heart, a cruel reminder of the terror that they were facing. Elena stood on the ice, watching the scene unfold with an expression that was unreadable, her eyes seeming to hold a deep and sinister knowledge that was beyond human comprehension. "It's awake," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind, which seemed to howl with a mournful intensity, as though it too felt the weight of the horror that was unfolding. The words hung in the air like a curse, a cold and calculated taunt that seemed to dare Ethan and Claire to try and escape the clutches of the monstrous forces that seemed to be driving them towards a terrible and unknown fate. Ethan raised the flare gun again, his hand shaking with fear as he tried to aim at the figure, which seemed to loom over them like a specter of death. But before he could fire, the ice beneath him gave way, the frozen surface shattering like glass as he fell through the gap. Time seemed to slow as he plummeted downwards, the water rushing up to meet him like a cold and unforgiving fist. Ethan's heart was racing, his mind reeling with the implications of what was happening. He was falling into the depths of the lake, into the dark and icy waters that seemed to hold secrets and terrors beyond his wildest imagination. The pressure was building in his ears, the water rushing past him like a torrent, threatening to consume him whole. And as he fell, Ethan knew that he was being pulled towards some terrible and ancient truth, a truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of the lake. He was being drawn into a world of unspeakable horror, a world where the laws of nature seemed to be twisted and distorted, where the very fabric of reality seemed to be torn apart. And Ethan knew that he might never escape, that he might be trapped forever in this living nightmare, tormented by the monstrous forces that seemed to be driving him towards a terrible and unknown fate. The thought was like a cold wind in his mind, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into his very bones. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Darkness swallowed Ethan whole, a suffocating shroud that seemed to wrap around him like a living entity, squeezing the air from his lungs with a merciless grip. The freezing water was a cold and unforgiving fist, crushing him with a pressure that seemed to build in his ears like a ticking time bomb, threatening to explode at any moment. He felt himself being pulled down into the depths of the lake, the water rushing past him like a torrent, carrying him towards a fate that was both unknown and unspeakable. But then, shapes moved in the deep, their presence like a whispered promise of terror. Hands brushed against him, their touch like ice, their fingers too long, too many. Ethan's mind recoiled in horror as he realized that he was not alone in the water. There were things down here with him, things that defied explanation, things that seemed to be made of the very darkness itself. They were the stuff of nightmares, the monstrous creations of a twisted and sadistic imagination. And then his foot struck solid ground. Ethan's mind reeled as he stumbled forward, his eyes straining to adjust to the dim light. He wasn't underwater. He was standing in a massive subterranean facility, the walls looming above him like giants, their concrete surfaces stained with the rust of age and decay. The air was thick with the stench of rot and corruption, a noxious odor that seemed to cling to everything like a bad omen. As his eyes adjusted to the light, Ethan saw that he was surrounded by bodies, their faces twisted in death, their eyes frozen in terror. They were the missing passengers, the ones who had vanished into thin air. And they were all here, floating in the water, their bodies preserved in a state of suspended animation, as though they were waiting for something, or someone. The sight was like a punch to the gut, a sickening realization that Ethan was not alone in his nightmare. Ethan's mind reeled as he stumbled forward, his eyes scanning the facility for any sign of life, any sign of what had happened to these people. But there was nothing, only the bodies, the water, and the darkness. And Ethan knew that he was not alone. There were things down here with him, things that watched him from the shadows, things that waited for him to make his next move. The thought sent a chill down his spine, a cold and creeping fear that seemed to seep into his very bones. He was trapped in a living nightmare, a desperate game of survival that seemed to have no end. The facility loomed before Ethan, its rusted hull a testament to the passage of time, a haunting reminder of the horrors that had been committed within its walls. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, the smell of rot and corruption that seemed to cling to everything like a bad omen. Ethan stumbled through the flooded corridors, his footsteps echoing off the walls as he struggled to make sense of his surroundings. Flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, making it seem as though the very darkness itself was moving, twisting and writhing like a living thing. As he walked, Ethan noticed that the walls were lined with screens, their glowing monitors casting an otherworldly light over the abandoned facility. The screens displayed files, rows of data that seemed to stretch on forever, a seemingly endless litany of codes, numbers, and cryptic messages. And then Ethan saw it. Arcadia Global's insignia, blinking on the monitors like a cold, calculating heartbeat, a reminder that he was in the clutches of a monstrous corporation that would stop at nothing to achieve its twisted goals. Project Prometheus. The screens read, status, phase 2, initiated, subjects, 10 confirmed, result, behavioral override, successful. Ethan's mind reeled as he struggled to understand the implications of what he was seeing. Behavioral override. What did that even mean? Was it some kind of mind control? A way to manipulate people's thoughts and actions? The thought sent a chill down his spine, a cold and creeping fear that seemed to seep into his very bones. And then, one last message appeared on the screens, the words flashing in red like a warning. Extraction. Imminent. Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline through his veins, a desperate urge to escape, to flee from the clutches of the monstrous forces that seemed to be driving him towards a terrible and unknown fate. He knew that he had to move, to keep moving, if he wanted to survive. But as he turned to run, Ethan realized that he was lost in the maze of corridors, the twisted labyrinth of the facility, seeming to shift and writhe around him like a living thing. He was trapped, alone and defenseless, in a place where the very laws of nature seemed to be twisted and distorted. The shadows seemed to move around him, the darkness coalescing into twisted, nightmarish forms that seemed to watch him with cold, calculating eyes. And Ethan knew that he might never escape, that he might be trapped forever in this living hell, tormented by the monstrous forces that seemed to be driving him towards a terrible and unknown fate. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had discovered. The truth was like a punch to the gut, a sickening realization that left him gasping for air. This wasn't a random crash, a tragic accident that had left them stranded in the frozen wilderness. No, this was something far more sinister. Arcadia Global had programmed them, manipulating their minds and bodies to serve some twisted purpose. The thought sent a chill down Ethan's spine, a cold and creeping fear that seemed to seep into his very bones. He felt like a puppet, a mere marionette, dancing on the strings of his corporate overlords. His mind was reeling with questions, with fears and doubts that seemed to multiply with every passing moment. What had they done to him? What had they programmed him to do? And what was the ultimate purpose of this twisted experiment? The questions swirled in his mind like a maelstrom, a vortex of fear and uncertainty that seemed to pull him under. As he stood there, frozen in horror, Ethan felt the weight of his newfound knowledge bearing down upon him. He was no longer just a survivor, a castaway struggling to stay alive in a hostile environment. No, he was something far more complex, a pawn in a twisted game of corporate manipulation. The realization was like a slap in the face, a wake-up call that left him reeling. He knew that he had to escape, to break free from the shackles of his programming and forge his own destiny. But as he looked around, he realized that he was trapped, surrounded by the very people who had programmed him. Elena, Marcus, and the others, they were all pawns in this twisted game, programmed to serve the whims of their corporate masters. And Ethan knew that his chances of escape were slim to none. He was caught in a web of deceit and manipulation, a web that seemed to tighten around him with every passing moment. The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins, a desperate urge to escape, to flee from the clutches of his corporate overlords. But as he turned to run, Ethan knew that he was running out of time. The clock was ticking, and he was running out of options. Ethan turned to find Claire staring at the monitors, her eyes wide with horror, her hands shaking like leaves in a hurricane. "They did this to us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own ragged breathing. The truth was sinking in, the weight of their discovery crushing her like a physical force. They had been manipulated, programmed like puppets, to serve the whims of their corporate masters. The thought was too much to bear, a suffocating weight that threatened to consume her. And then, something seemed to snap inside her. Her gaze hardened, her eyes flashing with determination like a spark of electricity. "We have to destroy it," she said, her voice firm, resolute. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a call to arms that seemed to echo off the walls of the facility. Ethan nodded in agreement, his mind racing with the implications of their discovery. But how could they destroy it? The facility was a labyrinth, a twisted maze of corridors and chambers that seemed to shift and writhe like a living thing. And they were trapped, surrounded by the very people who had programmed them. A new voice answered, its tone cold, calculating. "You can't." The words were like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of the odds that were stacked against them. Ethan turned to see Elena standing in the doorway, her eyes flashing with a sinister light like a warning signal. And she wasn't alone. Marcus stood beside her, his eyes vacant, his expression twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile. They were the enemy, the puppets of their corporate masters, and they would stop at nothing to keep Ethan and Claire from escaping. The air was thick with tension, the silence between them like a living thing that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Ethan knew that they had to act fast, to come up with a plan to destroy the facility and escape. But as he looked at Elena and Marcus, he knew that it wouldn't be easy. They were programmed to obey, to follow the orders of their corporate masters without question. And they would do everything in their power to stop Ethan and Claire from escaping. The others stood beside Elena, their bodies still recognizable, still human. But their eyes were something else entirely. They were black holes, voids of pure darkness that seemed to suck the very life out of Ethan. Marcus, Jackson, and the rest of the missing passengers stood with an unnatural stillness, their gazes cold, calculating, and utterly inhuman. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that they were no longer the people he had known. They had been transformed, altered in some fundamental way that made them unrecognizable, like puppets with their strings pulled by some malevolent force. Ethan gritted his teeth, his mind racing with the implications of what he was seeing. The truth was too horrific to contemplate, too monstrous to comprehend. "You're not them," he said, his voice firm, resolute, but shaking with a barely suppressed fear. Elena smiled, her eyes flashing with a sinister light, a cold and calculating glow that seemed to pierce Ethan's very soul. "We're better," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, a patronizing tone that made Ethan's blood boil. The words were like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of the horrors that had been perpetrated upon them. Ethan felt a wave of anger wash over him, a desperate desire to lash out, to fight back against the monsters that had once been his friends. But as he looked into their eyes, he knew that he was facing something truly evil, something that would stop at nothing to destroy him. And then, without warning, they attacked. Their bodies moved with a speed and agility that was unnatural, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly energy that seemed to propel them forward like puppets on strings. Ethan was caught off guard, his reactions slow compared to the lightning-fast movements of his attackers. He stumbled backward, his heart racing with fear as the others closed in around him. The air was thick with tension, the silence between them like a living thing that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Ethan knew that he was fighting for his life, that the others would stop at nothing to destroy him. He was trapped, surrounded by enemies who were once his friends, and he knew that his chances of escape were slim to none. The thought sent a chill down his spine, a cold and creeping fear that seemed to seep into his very bones. Ethan's mind was racing, his thoughts tumbling over each other in a desperate bid to survive. He knew that he had to think fast, to come up with a plan to defeat the others and escape. But as he looked into their eyes, he knew that he was facing an enemy unlike any other, an enemy that would stop at nothing to destroy him. Ethan fought like hell, his body fueled by a toxic mix of adrenaline and desperation. The fire axe he found in the corner of the room bit deep into the flesh of his attackers, the blade slicing through their bodies with a sickening crunch that seemed to echo through the corridors like a death knell. Blood, black and thick like oil, splattered the walls, pooling on the floor like a dark, viscous tide that seemed to drag everything down into its depths. The air was thick with the stench of death, the smell of rot and corruption that seemed to cling to everything like a bad omen. Claire fired the last flare into Marcus's chest, the bright orange flame erupting from the tube like a miniature sun that seemed to incinerate everything in its path. Marcus didn't even scream, his body simply collapsing to the ground, twitching and convulsing like a puppet with its strings cut. The others were just as relentless, their bodies driven by some twisted, inhuman force propel them forward like mindless, unstoppable machines. Ethan and Claire ran, their feet pounding the floor in a desperate bid to escape the carnage that surrounded them. The self-destruct alarms blared, the countdown beginning with a cold, mechanical voice that seemed to echo off the walls like a death sentence. 5 out minutes. That was all they had. 5 minutes to escape, to find a way out of the facility before it was consumed by flames. The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through Ethan's veins. A desperate urge to move, to keep moving no matter what. They sprinted through the corridors, their footsteps echoing off the walls like a ticking clock. The alarms grew louder, the countdown ticking away with a relentless, merciless precision that seemed to mock them with every passing second. Ethan knew that they had to move fast to find a way out of the facility before it was too late. But as he looked around, he knew that they were running out of options. The corridors seemed to stretch on forever, a twisted, labyrinthine maze that seemed to shift and writhe around them like a living thing, and the others were closing in, their bodies driven by a twisted, inhuman force that seemed to propel them forward like mindless, unstoppable machines. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of their desperation. Ethan and Claire were trapped in a desperate game of survival, a deadly cat-and-mouse chase through the corridors of the facility, and they were running out of time. The countdown was ticking away, the seconds slipping through their fingers like sand in an hourglass. They had to move, to keep moving if they wanted to survive. But as they ran, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded towards some unknown fate, a fate that was waiting for them just around the next corner. The facility was collapsing around them, the walls shuddering and trembling as the frozen lake above cracked and groaned, its icy surface splintering and shattering like 1,000 shards of glass. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of creaks and groans that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Ethan and Claire stumbled forward, their feet pounding the floor in a desperate bid to escape the chaos that surrounded them. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and ozone, the taste of fear and desperation hanging heavy on their tongues. They reached the final door, a maintenance tunnel leading to the surface, and Ethan's heart leapt with hope. They were going to make it. They were going to escape. But as they burst through the door, they were met with a sight that made Ethan's blood run cold. Elena was waiting for them, her eyes blazing with a fierce, unnatural intensity. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was twisted into a snarl, her lips curled back from her teeth in a feral, animalistic growl. "You think you're escaping?" she whispered, her voice low and menacing, like a snake slithering through the grass. "You are the experiment." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a cold and calculated taunt that seemed to strip Ethan of all his hope and leave him feeling naked and vulnerable. The truth was too horrific to contemplate, too monstrous to comprehend. They were not just survivors of a plane crash. They were test subjects, pawns in a twisted game of corporate manipulation. Ethan raised the axe, its weight solid and reassuring in his hands. "I don't care," he said, his voice firm and resolute. He didn't care what Elena said. He didn't care what the experiment was. All he cared about was escaping, getting out of this place alive. And if Elena was going to try and stop him, then he would do whatever it took to stop her. The adrenaline coursing through his veins seemed to amplify his senses, making every sound, every movement feel like a matter of life and death. And then he swung. The axe bit deep into Elena's shoulder, its blade slicing through her flesh with a sickening crunch that seemed to echo through the tunnel like a death knell. Elena's eyes widened in shock, her face contorting in a twisted grimace of pain. And then she fell, her body crashing to the ground with a sickening thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The sound was like a punctuation mark, a full stop that seemed to signal the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Ethan and Claire were free, but at what cost? The explosion shattered the ice, sending shards of frozen glass flying in all directions like 1,000 razor-sharp knives. Fire and smoke roared into the sky, a towering inferno that seemed to consume everything in its path, leaving nothing but a trail of destruction and despair in its wake. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of crackling flames and shattering ice that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, threatening to swallow everything whole. A rescue team found Ethan and Claire 2 days later, half frozen, delirious. They were huddled together, their bodies wrapped in a desperate bid for warmth, their eyes sunken, their skin pale and clammy. They didn't speak of what happened. They couldn't. The trauma was too fresh, too raw, too horrific. The memories were too monstrous, too twisted, too depraved. They were trapped in a living nightmare, a never-ending cycle of fear and terror that seemed to haunt them every waking moment, a constant reminder of the horrors they had endured. Because sometimes, survival isn't the victory you think it is. Sometimes, the real horror is what you bring back with you. The memories, the scars, the emotional trauma. These are the things that haunt you, that follow you home, that lurk in the shadows of your mind, waiting to pounce. Ethan and Claire had survived the facility, but they had not escaped unscathed. They had been forever changed by their experiences, their minds and bodies scarred by the horrors they had endured. And in Ethan's reflection, a glimpse of something monstrous stared back. His eyes weren't human anymore. They were black, empty, soulless. They were the eyes of a creature that had been driven to the brink of madness. A creature that had been forged in the depths of horror and despair. Ethan's eyes were a window to his soul. A soul that had been forever damaged by the traumas he had endured. They were a reminder that some wounds never heal, some scars never fade. They were a testament to the horrors that Ethan and Claire had faced, and the terrible price they had paid to survive. The end.